Hello, student. This is Maneza. Welcome in our fourth session. I hope it's our third or fourth session. Today, I'm going to discuss with you the introduction of English poetry. I mean, the introduction of poetry as a genre of English literature. I'll also discuss with you different types of this genre as well as the function of this genre. The first question that arises is, what is poetry? Actually, to me, poetry is a harmonious and lyrical blend of thoughts and feelings in the words. I find it the simplest definition of poetry. When we talk about English poetry, not only historically but on the grounds of as a genre of English literature, then poetry is divided in two major parts. I mean, there are two major classifications of English poetry. These classifications are known as subjective poetry and objective poetry. Now, the question arises, what is meant by subjective poetry? I used to answer my students in a very simple way by using the concept of objective and subjective. Subjective paper is based on essay type questions, is based on long questions, means that in subjective paper you have a choice of your own. You can use your own thoughts, you can use your own words to answer all those essay type questions that are the part of that subjective paper. So subjective means anything in which the writer or the author is allowed to voice himself or herself, or simply he or she can express in his or her own way. So this is the simplest definition of subjective. And when we apply the very concept on subjective poetry, then we can define it, or we can assume that subjective poetry is a type of poetry in which a poet aims to convey his personal experiences. Means a poet speaks on his own. A poet can share his own biography even. A poet can share his own views. And it is distinguished from the narrative poetry of ballad and epic. Because in ballad and epic, the poet isn't allowed to speak on his own. I mean, poet is not allowed to be personal. He or she can never be the part of that very poetry in objective poetry. But in subjective poetry, a poet, either he or she, is allowed to voice himself or herself in that very poem or that very piece of writing. This kind of poetry is called subjective poetry. And another prime feature of subjective poetry is that it is mostly lyrical. There are some types of poems that fall into the category of subjective poetry, which are elegy, ode, and sonnet. I'll just briefly highlight all these three types of subjective poetry. As we all know that elegy is some sort of a mourning song, a poem or a piece of poetry that is composed on the death of someone, and or that talks about or that mourns the death of somebody. And in up till now in the history of English literature, Gray's elegy is considered the most celebrated elegy of English literature. And in that very elegy, Gray mourns the death of common man. So this is the uniqueness of that elegy, that it celebrates, sorry, it mourns the death of a common man, and in that way it celebrates the common man as well. Then comes ode. When we relate this concept of ode with our Urdu poetry, we can find a genre that is normally called ghazal in Urdu. So, ode is a kind of ghazal. In this type of poem, a poet is also allowed to share his own views, his own personal experiences. Then comes sonnet. In sonnet, there is a compulsion or there is a pattern. Sonnets are the poems that are consisted of 14 lines. The first 8 lines are called a octave, and the last 6 lines are called sestet. In sonnet, in the first 8 lines, means in octave, situation is invoked or is introduced. Then in this next half, in the sestet, that very condition, that very situation is resolved harmoniously. So this is the normal pattern of a sonnet. Sonnet must be a sonnet must be a lyrical poem. So with this, here ends the definition of or the explanation of subjective poetry. Next comes objective poetry. As the earlier definition of subjective poetry elaborates clearly that in objective poetry, we we don't give poet a space for expressing his own self, for expressing his own experiences. A subjective poem or the subjective poetry must be based on the principles of impersonality. A poet should remain impersonal. Art should be conveyed as art, not as a personal experience. This is the simplest definition of objective poetry. And it can also be lyrical as well. There are some categories of poems that fall into this very classification of objective poetry. It must be narrative, it must be dramatic. These are the prime features of objective poetry, and some types of poems fall into this category of objective poetry. These are ballad, epic, romance, and idyll. Now, as we all know, ballads are the songs like folk songs or folklores. Their tone is just like folk songs, and they are normally narrative. Then comes epic. Epic, as we all know, is a long narrative poem with some serious and dignified subject matter, and that conveys some elevated thought, and it has a magnificent and lofty language. And romances are normally written in the Old English time period, and they are no more in poetry, or they are no more common in the current or modern domain of English literature. Romances can be like you can say a lyrical or sort of narrative that is telling some story. Then comes idyll. Idyll is something that is a poem that is based on a short description of some incident, some picaresque description of an incident and it has rustic settings in it. So these are the two major classifications of English poetry, subjective and objective. And I have and here ends the discussion on subjective and objective poetry, because we have discussed subjective poetry in its details with its further kinds, and then objective poetry with its further classifications. Then I will also like to talk about the functions of English poetry, or the functions of poetry, briefly, because normally the students of English literature, they ask this kind of question, that uh, what is the basic purpose of poetry or writing poetry, especially I have uh, been remained teaching the beginner classes like BS classes. In those classes, students normally have this sort of concerns, that what is the sole purpose of poetry, why do people write poetry. So to me, I just like a very beautiful definition on the functions of poetry by D.H. Lawrence. According to D.H. Lawrence, the sole purpose of poetry, the sole function of the poetry, is to discover a new world within the known world. So, new ideas and new thoughts are emerged in poetry. Poetry especially enables its reader to, or listener, to not only feel but also to visualize the emotions, the feelings, the passions. And another very important thing, that, or a very important purpose that is served by poetry, is that poetry enables its reader to see the chaotic world, the anarchic world, in the harmony of words. So these are some beautiful functions of poetry, and same is uh, the function of English poetry, because poetry literature is universal. So functions of each and every genre of literature are universal. But my focal aim is to explain the things that are related to English literature. So I have tried my level best to explain the concept of English poetry, the classifications, the types, and functions. Thank you so much. See you next time with some other genre or some historical insight in the history of English literature, or in the history of a particular genre. Thank you so much. Allah Hafiz.